We've invited Colleen Crangle, and Martha Luemers will interview her for our Sharing the Journey session in today's service. Please welcome them.
It's become a recent Are we good now? Okay. It's become a recent tradition at this church that on the second Sunday of the month, we, instead of a sermon, we share our journeys. Usually Pastor Jeff does the interviewing, but he's on sabbatical, and so I have the very great privilege of speaking with Colleen Crangle today. She's both one of our two newest members of the church, and also, I believe it marks her debut with the choir. In a bit of synchronicity, I think you'll find that on the UCC calendar today, it is both Racial Justice Sunday and Science and Technology Sunday, and that, I can't tell you how that, well, you'll find out how that resonates with Colleen's story. I also just wanted to mention that Colleen's picked the scripture readings today, as well as the second hymn, which is a new one, at least for me. And with that, Colleen, I noticed that in our new directory, we had the opportunity to put in some fun facts, and yours was that you had immigrated to this country twice. So some literal journeying. Why don't we start with the first time you immigrated? Could you tell us about that?
We spent the first 9 years of my life in Zimbabwe. I spent the first 9 years of my life in Zimbabwe with an Irish father and a South African mother. And as an Irishman, my father's great dream was to immigrate to the United States. And so we did. Came over by boat, took the Queen Mary, the second leg, and landed in New York, and took a Greyhound bus down to Miami Beach, and stayed in an apartment that overlooked the ocean. My mother was extremely homesick, and so after a year, we then moved to South Africa. And so that was my first immigration. It was Camelot, Kennedy's time. It was a very special time to be here in this country.
All right. How about the second time? What's the story of you coming back to the United States?
Well, as many of you know, South Africa was an apartheid regime, institutionalized racial segregation for a long time until 1990, 1994. So when I landed back there in the 60s and the 70s, it was a very strange place to land as a child into a world that was so strangely divided and with almost no awareness on the part of the minority white regime and the white inhabitants that there was anything wrong with the situation. Now, my parents, being a little outside of the world, my father in particular, made it clear that this was not right. But they were people of their time, and they had their own layers of racial blindness. And as ultra-conservative Christians, they believed their role was to pray for the government, not to oppose it. So I grew up with this strange dichotomy of, yes, all this is wrong, and no, we don't do that, and we don't do this, but that's the way things are. So by the time I was a young adult living on my own, to me, it got to the point where my daily experience was one of being co-opted into unavoidable and vile acts of discrimination. You could not be a part of them if you were there. So a few examples. The first one may seem minor, but it was emblematic of what was happening. I would stop at the corner cafe every day for milk or bread on the way home from work. And if you walked in, went up to the counter, and if there was a black man or woman who was trying to buy something, the shopkeeper would say, out the way, and call you forward to serve you. So just naturally I would say, oh, no, he was first, please go ahead. That would make the shopkeeper so irate that he would end up shouting at the person who was there to be served, piling on more abuse. So the only way to deal with it for me while I was there was to wait and watch and see. As long as there was no one else at the counter, I'd go forward. There were many other incidents like this. One more troubling example, for instance, I was working as an assistant professor in the computer science department. I had stayed in South Africa until I'd finished my master's degree in computer science. And the man who worked as a messenger in our department needed help because his wife was picked up off the street and put in jail because her identity document that every person of color had to carry did not give her permission to live there with her husband. She'd been born elsewhere. And she was going to be sent back. And this had happened several times, just pick her up off the street, put her in jail. So I, in my naivety, when he told me this, as I noticed how upset he was, I said, oh, that shouldn't happen. I can help you. And found an apartheid official who said he could help. And we went down for the interview. As we got to my car, Isaac, his name was Isaac, he got into the back and he insisted. I said, no, come and sit here. To me, that's extremely rude. But he was insistent and he was nervous on the drive. And I found out later from my older colleagues that had we been seen by the police, we would have been stopped and he would have been in danger of being arrested simply on the suspicion of being that close in that kind of situation with a white woman. So, and that happened other times when I would give a ride to someone I saw on the side of the road, absolutely insisted. We're sitting in the back of the car. So every moment you were there, you were co-opted. There was one particular incident as well, if you'd like me.
Yes, please.
To share that with you. The university I worked in was unusual in that it had a few Black professional staff. And I was friends with one. We'd actually met in a lunchtime Bible study. His name was Lot. And he arrived in my office one day with his arms like this, full of his papers and folders. They were falling out of his arms. And he said, I've been fired. I've been told to leave. This was a period in the 70s of unrest, and he had stayed home the day before to protect his property. And he arrived at work and said, you're fired. And of course, in my naivety, I said, no, that can't be. You've got an employment contract. They have to give you notice. And I phoned the personnel department, and very soon after was told, a message came down to my department head to tell me to mind my own business. And I decided this was my business. So I tried to get help from the colleague I had in the law department who went outside and found lawyers. But the fact was, this was entirely legal, that all Black staff were hired on contracts that allowed 1 day's notice. All the Black staff, no white staff. There was nothing that could be done. Just as a note, Lot ended up immigrating to Canada where he got political asylum, and he lives there to this day. But that was the kind of situation on a daily basis, if you were aware of it. When, as a child, my parents pointed out what was actually happening, even though I didn't want to do anything about it, once you see that as a child, you can't unsee it. And it got to the point where I decided I just could not live in South Africa anymore. And I'd always thought of the United States as my second home. So again, in my naivety, I wrote to Stanford and said, I'm a computer scientist, but I'd like to come study in your philosophy department. And next year I was here. And that's how the second immigration happened. Oh, no, just a fun note. The very first night here in California, we spent in the Sequoias. A family friend lived there, and there's a guest room there. And so my then husband and I spent the night in that guest room.
Well, at the time you immigrated the second time, did you have a vision of what life was like in the United States compared to South Africa?
Yeah, I really came here with the immigrant's dream, not of commercial success, although that's perfectly all right economically, but of a country where at least the ideal of justice was upheld, and that all were equal under the law. I really believe that, and I really wanted to live in a country that had those ideals and those practices.
So I know from getting to know you a little bit over the last week that you had a chance, or I don't know if chance is the right word, you had an experience that caused you to test that ideal. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I loved the research I did after finishing my PhD. It was at Stanford, and the first funding I got was actually for a project in AI, artificial intelligence, and health. So I worked on that for a few years, loved it, took a little time off to have 2 babies, and then went back to the School of Medicine. I was invited to join a project that sorely needed my help, and it was just wonderful to be back at work. Women who've had babies or men who've taken time off to look after babies, you know how when you get back to work, how all your energy is there. And I threw myself into the work and met with wonderful success, a lot of invitations to give talks and to collaborate. And then things got rather suddenly very strange. Restrictions started to be placed on me as to who I could work with, what I could do in that work. And when I questioned them, I was told quite simply that a colleague found me a threat. And I assured this colleague I wanted to work with him, but things didn't change. In fact, they got more and more absurd. And I, of course, pushed back on this and took the time to make notes about what was happening. I would send emails, I would keep the emails. But the restrictions actually got to the point where they were absurd. I was to work in a place where I had no fixed desk, no computer that I could call my own. It was retaliation 101. And it culminated in the dean, associate dean, calling me into his office one day, closing the door and saying, "Let me tell you how things are around here." And as a note, that department, in all its 12 years, had never had a senior scientist who was a woman. I was the first. And all the men knew each other well, had worked together, or were each other's student or mentor. It was the prototypical old boys club. He said, "You need to understand that your role in this department is nothing more than to assist your colleague." Of course, I said, "This could not be. You're asking me to be this person's girl Friday." And he said, "Yes, but don't let it worry you. It could just as easily have been a boy Friday." So I said, "This can't be," and I continued to refuse the circumstances they were trying to impose on me. And it came to a head one day when I came into work and I found a letter saying, "This is your last day of work." And I had just that night to try and take work information from the computer so that I could continue my work. And I was out of a job the next day. Of course, I immediately thought of Lot and what had happened to him. And I thought, this can't be, not here. And so began a 3-year journey in which I took Stanford to federal court for discrimination, sex discrimination, and I won. And this was the first sex discrimination case that had ever gone to trial against Stanford, despite, as many of you are aware, years and years of very public concerns, particularly in the School of Medicine, about how women are treated. 3 years. It was an arduous journey. It was a David and Goliath battle, but I had to see it through. People would ask, why didn't you go get another job? And there were other jobs elsewhere. I would have had to have got my family to move, but I just said, I have to see this through. I have to believe that in this country, when you make things known what's actually happening and it is unjust or discriminatory, that people won't get away with it, that you can't do things behind closed doors and treat people with this kind of discrimination. I had to have that known and evaluated. I had to have it come before people in a court of law, and for people to say, no, there are anti-discrimination laws in this country, you can't do that. So 3 years to go through the processes of discovery and a lot of shenanigans. Stanford hired 2 outside firms of attorneys in addition to their in-house attorneys, because they expected me to back down. They got very deep pockets. But I didn't, and we prevailed. That's what happened.
Wow. Well, Colleen, so you've had some big literal journeys, a journey pursuing justice. Perhaps we could turn to your spiritual journey. You mentioned growing up in a conservative Christian household. Could you say a little bit about the spiritual tradition of your family when you grew up?
Yes, both my parents were fundamentalist Christians, my father in the Baptist Brethren tradition and my mother in the Pentecostal church. And in fact, in Miami, we were put into a Christian school, and when we left, I was given this Bible. I still have it. I still use it. Having parents in different churches might seem a little uncomfortable. One of the advantages is it gave me some perspective, because these 2 churches, as churches were in South Africa at that time, they were openly antagonistic to each other, criticizing each other's theology and practices. And it gave me some perspective at evaluating the world I was in. And I never stopped being a Christian, never stopped being a believer, but of course looked at things in a completely different light and did not hold dogma in much concern. Being a Christian is not about adhering to particular dogma for me.
So when you came to this country, where did you land in terms of a church?
The first one I went to was an Episcopal church, because the family friends of the ones who had taken us to the Sequoias, they were at a nice Episcopalian church, and I went there for a while, and then a Presbyterian church, but that Presbyterian church withdrew from the Presbyterian community because they did not agree with gay marriage, so I left that church and went to a Methodist church for many years in Palo Alto. Over the recent years, my values and the values of the church were no longer in alignment, and I had been looking around, and I knew Stelly and had met Jeff, and so came here, and I haven't left, actually, from that first day.
Well, lucky us. Is there, where do you find inspiration today spiritually?
Well, I really do find it in the Bible still. This is my old King James Bible. And I don't read it, as of course you all share this thought with me, to find out exactly what literal words mean and take it as the word of God. But it is a wonderful source of knowing about people over centuries who have also longed to know God, to know the divine, to live a spiritual life, and to read and share in their insights is so helpful, so wonderful. And during the Stanford struggle, I turned to the Bible a lot, Psalms in particular and others, to find strength and hope. So that has remained extremely important in my Christian life. When you asked me this the other day, I immediately also said nature. That's God. I also said music. Then I followed that with and dogs. I'm not joking about that. I mean, if you want to know unconditional love, you have a dog. So I was told that, yes, or a cat. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess as a last question, I noticed when also scanning the new directory that you had signed up for the Community Engagement Committee. I wondered what drew you to that committee?
Well, first Steli asked me, so I said yes. I like the idea of being conscious, mindful about engaging with each other as a church community and with the outside world, because with the decline we all know about in church membership and churches closing, we have to ask, what is a church? Why do we gather together as Christians? What's important to us? How are we perceived in the world? How do we engage with the world around us? And so that committee seemed to offer those opportunities, and I am looking forward to working in that committee here and singing with the choir.
Well, Colleen, thank you so much for doing this. We're so glad to have you as a member of the church, as a member of the choir, and just thank you for sharing your amazing story.
Thank you very much.